The air in the back room of the Italian restaurant on Pleasant Avenue wasn't just filled with smoke, it was heavy with the expectation of violence. It was a Tuesday, late October, the kind of night where the rain slicked the cobblestones of East Harlem and kept the civilians indoors, leaving the streets to the wolves. Inside that room, 5 men sat around a table laden with veal, heavy red wine, and the unspoken certainty that by sunrise they would own 125th Street. They were men who spoke in gestures, whose silence usually meant someone was about to die. They were waiting. But they weren't waiting for a fight. They were waiting for a surrender. The man at the head of the table, a capo from the Genovese family, wiped his mouth with a linen napkin. He checked his watch. He adjusted the cufflink on his wrist. He was comfortable. Why wouldn't he be? The logic of the underworld was simple. The strong take and the weak bend. And tonight, the numbers, the manpower, and the political backing were all on his side. He had 50 soldiers waiting in cars 3 blocks away. He had the precinct captain in his pocket. He had the inevitability of the mob's expansion at his back. Then the heavy oak door creaked. It didn't slam open. It didn't burst off its hinges. It simply unlatched and swung inward with a slow, deliberate weight. The conversation at the table died instantly. The clinking of silverware on china stopped. The only sound left was the rain drumming against the darkened window pane and the rhythmic, steady tap of hard-soled shoes on the wooden floor. One man walked in, just one. He wasn't running, he wasn't crouching, he didn't have a gun in his hand. He wore a charcoal gray suit pressed to a razor's edge, a fedora slightly tipped, and a demeanor that suggested he was walking into his own living room rather than a lion's den. He didn't look at the soldiers standing by the wall. He didn't look at the knives on the table. He looked only at the capo. The silence stretched. It stretched until it became a physical thing, a wire pulled so tight it had to snap. The capo stared, waiting for the plea, waiting for the negotiation, waiting for the fear to show itself in the eyes of the man from Harlem. But there was no fear. There was only a terrifying, hollow calm. The intruder stopped at the edge of the table. He didn't sit. He placed his hands on the back of an empty chair, leaned forward slightly, and let the silence hang for 10 more seconds. When he finally opened his mouth, he didn't shout, he didn't threaten. He spoke in a voice barely above a whisper, a voice that sounded like gravel grinding under a heavy tire. You think you have the city surrounded. You think because you have the guns you have the power, but you made a mistake. You forgot who drives your cars. You forgot who cooks your meals. You forgot who tucks your children in at night. The capo's face went pale. The cigar froze halfway to his mouth. The air left the room. In that split second, the dynamic of the universe shifted. The guns in the waistbands of the men against the wall suddenly felt useless. The 50 soldiers 3 blocks away might as well have been on the moon, because the threat wasn't about bullets. It was about access. It was about the invisible army that this man commanded. The maids, the doormen, the chauffeurs, the people the mob didn't see, but who saw everything. The man in the charcoal suit smiled, cold and devoid of humor. You go home before you don't have a home to go to. If you're drawn to the untold power stories of Harlem and the men who ruled without noise, you're already in the right place. This is Bumpy Johnson Files. Subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now. The history books will tell you about the wars that happened. They will give you the dates of the massacres, the names of the victims, the caliber of the bullets found in the walls. They categorize history by the noise it makes. But true power, the kind that shapes generations and draws borders that no government can erase, is rarely found in the gunfire. It is found in the moments where a single sentence spoken in a quiet room stopped a river of blood from flowing. The files on this night were not burned because they were never written. The police reports don't exist because the police were never called. What happened between the Italian Mafia and the Godfather of Harlem in that autumn of 1958 was erased from the official narrative because it terrified the people who write the history. It was a moment where the hierarchy of organized crime was exposed as fragile, where the illusion of invincibility was shattered not by a battalion of soldiers, but by the mind of one man who understood a fundamental truth about human nature. Fear is not about what you can do to a man. It is about what you can do to the things he loves. But to understand the weight of that silence in the restaurant, you have to understand the noise that preceded it. You have to understand the man, not as the legend he became, but as the human being he was in the moments before the legend hardened. Ellsworth Johnson didn't wake up that morning thinking about war. He woke up thinking about survival, not his own. He had made peace with his own mortality years ago, but the survival of the ecosystem he had built. Harlem was not just a territory to him. It was a living, breathing organism. It was the jazz clubs on 125th Street where the saxophones cried out the pain of a generation. It was the stoops where old women watched the world with tired, knowing eyes. It was the numbers runners moving like ghosts through the alleyways, carrying the hopes of people who had nothing else to gamble on but luck. He felt the weight of every soul in that neighborhood. It was a crushing, suffocating pressure. When you are the king, you are also the father, the judge, and the shield. He knew that the encroachment of the Italian families wasn't just about business, it was about erasure. If they took the numbers, if they took the heroin trade, if they took the protection rackets, they wouldn't just take the money, they would take the dignity of the place. They would turn Harlem into a colony, a plantation managed from downtown. And he was tired. There were nights he would sit in his study, the chessboard set up in front of him, staring at the pieces for hours without moving a pawn. He wasn't looking for a move, he was looking for a way out. He knew the mathematics of violence better than anyone. He knew that if he went to war with the 5 families, he would lose. They had the numbers. They had the political machine. They could flood Harlem with enough soldiers to turn Lenox Avenue into a graveyard. He could fight them for a month, maybe a year, but the end was mathematically inevitable. He felt the fear of that inevitability in his gut. It was a cold, gnawing sensation. He looked at his wife, at his daughters, and he saw the targets painted on their backs. He knew that the Italians didn't play by the rules of the street anymore. They were corporate now. They were ruthless efficiency. If he fought them with guns, they would burn everything he loved to the ground. He had to find another way. He had to find a weapon they didn't have in their arsenal. He had to find a vulnerability they didn't know they had. The encroachment started slowly, like a rising tide. First, it was the independent runners being squeezed. Then it was the suppliers raising their prices, claiming logistical issues that everyone knew were orders from downtown. Then came the messengers, men in expensive suits who didn't belong in Harlem, parking their Cadillacs on 7th Avenue, walking into the clubs with smiles that didn't reach their eyes. They offered partnerships, they offered protection, but the translation was clear. Hand over the keys, and we might let you keep the scraps. Bumpy watched it all. He didn't react. He didn't send his hitters to clear the corners. He let them push. He let them think he was getting old, that he was getting soft, that the years in Alcatraz had broken his spirit. He needed them to believe that. Arrogance is a blinder. When a man thinks he is fighting a sheep, he leaves his throat exposed. He spent his days in the chess club playing against the old men who had been there since the Depression. He sat in the barber shop, listening to the gossip, listening to the rhythm of the street. But while he appeared to be idle, his mind was working at a velocity that would have terrified his enemies. He wasn't planning a defense, he was mapping the battlefield. He began to gather information, not about shipment routes or bank accounts. That was what the police looked for. He looked for the human connections. He sent his people out, not with guns, but with questions. He wanted to know who cleaned the capo's house in Jersey. He wanted to know who drove the consiglieri's wife to church. He wanted to know who delivered the groceries to the boss's mistress in Brooklyn. He realized something that the Italian bosses, in their hubris, had completely overlooked. They lived in a world of segregation, but their lives were maintained by the very people they looked down upon. The unseen workforce of New York City, the maids, the cooks, the nannies, the drivers, were overwhelmingly black. They were the people of Harlem. They were Bumpy's people. They were the invisible arteries that kept the Italian households running. The realization hit him in the middle of a game of chess. He was holding a knight hovering over the board. He looked at the piece not as a horse, but as a jumper, a piece that could leap over defenses, that could strike from behind the lines. He set the knight down. He didn't take the opponent's queen. He simply moved into a position where the king was trapped, not by force, but by the geometry of the board. The tension in Harlem was becoming unbearable. The Italians were getting impatient. A shop owner on 116th Street was beaten within an inch of his life for refusing to pay the new tax. A numbers runner was found in the Hudson River. The message was getting louder: submit or die. His lieutenants were restless. They wanted blood. They came to him, guns tucked into their waistbands, eyes burning with the need for retaliation. "We can't let them do this, Bumpy," they said. "We have to hit back. We have to show them." He looked at them, these young men who were ready to throw their lives away for a block of pavement. He loved them, and he pitied them. They thought power was a loud noise. They didn't understand that the loudest noise is the one you never hear. "Put the guns away," he told them. "But Bumpy," "I said put them away. We are not going to fight them. We are going to stop them." He didn't explain. He never explained. To explain was to dilute the authority. He simply gave orders. He told one lieutenant to find the name of the woman who cooked for the Genovese capo. He told another to find the schedule of the driver who took the Lucchese boss's daughter to school. He began to compile a dossier. It wasn't a dossier of crimes. It was a dossier of domestic intimacy. The night of the meeting was set. The Italians had called it. They framed it as a peace conference, but Bumpy knew what it was. It was a ceremony of surrender. They expected him to come with his hat in his hand, to kiss the ring, to accept a percentage and fade into history. He dressed slowly that evening. Every item of clothing was armor. The crisp white shirt, the silk tie, the cufflinks that caught the light. He looked at himself in the mirror. He didn't see a gangster. He saw a diplomat of the streets. He saw a man who was about to walk into a furnace and turn down the heat. He kissed his wife goodbye. He didn't tell her where he was going. He didn't want her to carry the burden of the night. He walked out into the rain, waved off his driver, and began to walk. He walked down the wet streets of Harlem, watching the neon lights reflect in the puddles. He felt the pulse of the neighborhood under his feet. This was what he was fighting for, not the money, the right to exist. He crossed the invisible line that separated Harlem from Italian Harlem. The atmosphere changed. The faces on the street changed. The eyes that watched him were suspicious, hostile. He kept walking. He didn't hurry. To hurry is to show anxiety. To walk slowly is to own the time. He reached the restaurant on Pleasant Avenue. The windows were dark, the sign flickering. Two men in trench coats stood by the door. They patted him down. They found nothing. No gun, no knife, no wire. They looked at each other, confused. A man walking into a sit-down with the 5 families without a weapon? He was either a fool or he was suicidal. They opened the door for him. And this is where the timeline slows down. This is where the air gets thin. Bumpy walked through the main dining room. It was empty, chairs upturned on the tables. The kitchen staff peered through the swinging doors, their eyes wide. They knew who he was. They knew what was happening in the back room. He reached the back door. He paused for a fraction of a second. He took a breath, filling his lungs with the scent of garlic and old wood. He centered himself. He locked away the fear, locked away the anger, locked away the doubt. He became pure will. He opened the door. We are back in the room. The smoke, the silence, the capo. The moment Bumpy delivered the line, "You forgot who tucks your children in at night," the reality of the situation crashed down on the Italian bosses. It wasn't a threat of violence in the traditional sense. It was a violation of the sanctuary. The mob operated on a strict bifurcation. The street was for business. The home was for family. The home was sacred. The home was safe. Bumpy Johnson had just told them that their homes were glass houses and he held the stones. He reached into his jacket pocket. The bodyguards flinched, hands diving for their guns. Bumpy didn't pull a weapon. He pulled out a piece of paper, a single folded sheet of lined notebook paper. He tossed it onto the table. It landed softly next to the wine bottle. "Read it," Bumpy said. The capo hesitated. He looked at the paper as if it were a bomb. Slowly, he reached out and unfolded it. It wasn't a list of demands. It wasn't a map of territories. It was a list of names. Maria, Sophia, Anthony, little Carlo. It was a list of their children, and next to each name a detail. Allergy to peanuts, loves the blue blanket, gets picked up at 3:15 p.m. at St. Mary's, sleeps with the window open. The capo's hands began to shake. The paper rattled against the table. The other men leaned in, reading the text. A collective gasp, sucked in through clenched teeth, went around the room. This was intelligence of the highest order. It was intimate. It was total. It showed that Bumpy hadn't just been watching them. He had been living with them. His people were the ghosts in their hallways. Bumpy leaned in closer, his voice dropping another octave. "I don't want a war. War is bad for business. It's bad for the soul. I want peace. But peace comes from respect, and respect comes from understanding." He pointed a manicured finger at the paper. "You can kill me tonight. You can walk out of here and burn Harlem to the ground. But if you do, if anything happens to me or my men or my neighborhood, the people who love your children will receive a phone call, and they will walk out of your houses, but they might leave something behind, or take something with them. He let the implication hang there. He didn't need to say more. He wasn't threatening to kill children. He was threatening to disrupt the sanctity of their lives, to shatter the illusion of safety that they paid for with blood money. He was holding a mirror up to their hypocrisy. You kill our sons in the street. We hold yours in our arms. The capo looked up from the paper. His eyes were wide, stripped of their arrogance. He looked at Bumpy Johnson and he didn't see a thug. He saw a grand master. He saw a man who had flanked them in a way they hadn't even conceived of. There was a long silence, a silence that weighed 1,000 pounds. The capo looked at his consigliere. The consigliere gave a barely perceptible nod. It was a nod of defeat. "What do you want, Bumpy?" the capo asked. His voice was different now. The command was gone. It was the voice of a man negotiating for his life. "I want what is mine," Bumpy said. "I want 110th to 155th. No interference, no taxes, no messengers. We do business, we do it respectfully, but Harlem is Harlem, and it stays Harlem." The capo swallowed. He looked at the paper again. He picked it up, folded it carefully, and put it in his pocket. It was a gesture of acceptance. He was keeping the reminder. "Done," the capo said. Bumpy didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply nodded. "Good evening, gentlemen." He turned his back on them. He turned his back on 5 armed men who wanted him dead. It was the ultimate display of dominance. They knew they wouldn't shoot. They couldn't shoot. He had checkmated them. He walked out of the room. He walked back through the empty restaurant. He walked out into the rain. As he stepped onto the sidewalk, he let out a breath he felt he had been holding for a month. His hands, deep in his pockets, finally unclenched. He lit a cigarette, the flame illuminating his face for a brief second. He looked tired, but he looked free. Word spread through the underworld by morning, not the details. The details were too shameful for the Italians to repeat. The story that spread was simply that Bumpy Johnson had walked into the lion's den and walked out with the lion's teeth in his pocket. The cars that had been circling Harlem disappeared. The new dealers vanished. The pressure lifted. The war that was supposed to tear the city apart never happened. The blood that was supposed to flow stayed in the veins of the young men. Harlem breathed. It was a victory of the mind over the muscle. It was a testament to the power of information, of leverage, of understanding the human heart. Bumpy Johnson knew that every man, no matter how powerful, has a weakness. He has something he loves more than power. And if you can hold that thing in your hand, gently, you own the man. He didn't need an army to stop the Mafia. He just needed to remind them that they were human. Years later, when the legends were being written, people would talk about Bumpy's knife skills, his shootouts, his prison fights. They would focus on the violence. But the old heads, the ones who were there, they knew the truth. They knew that the king of Harlem kept his crown not because he was the loudest, but because he was the quietest. He understood that true power is not about making people afraid of what you will do. It is about making them afraid of what you know. In a world of noise, silence is the heaviest weapon. And on that rainy night in 1958, Bumpy Johnson deafened the mob with a whisper. This is Bumpy Johnson Files. Subscribe for the stories history tried to bury.